Hello and welcome to my lecture on punishment. In this lecture, I'm going to explain the philosophical theory behind why punishment is justified, and then I'm going to review some arguments that America's current criminal punishment regime is seriously unjust, and then I'm going to talk about some ways in which the system should be reformed. First, what is punishment? Punishment is a kind of action which inflicts harm on another person and does so intentionally. In other words, you specifically want the other person to be harmed. And it's done in response to some wrongful or otherwise undesired behavior by the other person. The most common punishments used in America's justice system are incarceration and fines. Fines for relatively minor offenses and incarceration, that is, sending people to prison or jail, is used for more serious offenses. Is punishment ever justified? Some philosophers say no. For example, my colleague David Boonin has written a book called The Problem of Punishment, in which he basically argues that punishment in general is unjustified, even if another person has done a serious wrong. Now, I basically just assume that the answer is yes, punishment is sometimes justified. And I'm not going to give detailed arguments about this because it would take too long and take us too far away from the things that I want to get to. But basically, I think punishment is justified on intuitive grounds. Most people have the intuition that if a person commits serious wrongs, then it is appropriate to punish them and morally justified. And in general, I argue that correct ethical judgments can only be based upon ethical intuition. And if you want to see more about that, see my book, Ethical Intuitionism. Now, why do we imprison people? Traditionally, there are basically three reasons that are given for imprisoning criminals. The first is known as the incapacitation rationale. This rationale is the fact that while somebody is in prison, they're just physically prevented from committing any further crimes against the regular non-prison population. Of course, they can still commit crimes against other prisoners and possibly against the guards, but the rest of society is protected from them during their prison sentence. The second rationale is known as deterrence. The idea here is that if you do something unpleasant to people who commit crimes, then that is going to frighten other people away from committing crimes, and it's going to possibly frighten those same people from committing crimes in the future after they're released. The third rationale is known as retribution or retributive justice. This is the idea that some people just simply deserve to suffer because they've done bad things, and justice requires giving people what they deserve. Now, I'm going to give some arguments to show that the retributive justice rationale is necessary. It may not be sufficient, but it is necessary to explain the justice of punishment. And I'm going to argue for that by explaining why the other rationales are not sufficient. So first, let's start with the rationale of deterrence. And I'd like you to consider this hypothetical example. So suppose that a high-profile crime has been committed in a certain community, and the sheriff of the town can't find the actual perpetrator of the crime. But what he could do is he could frame an innocent person, which would convince the town that the innocent person is guilty and would cause that person to be sent to prison for the crime. Now, since almost everyone would believe that the perpetrator of the crime was punished, this would deter crime about as well as punishing the actual perpetrator would have done. Future people who are considering committing a crime will remember that case and they will think that the perpetrator got punished, and so they'll be afraid to commit a crime. So, question, what should the sheriff do? And almost everyone agrees that the sheriff may not frame the innocent person, and that would be very morally wrong. Now, what this shows is that deterrence is insufficient to justify criminal punishment. It might be necessary, but it's not sufficient by itself if the punishment is otherwise unjust. Now let's consider the incapacitation rationale. So here's a real case. In the 1970s, Paul Lewis Hayes was convicted of attempting to pass a forged check for $88, which was classified as a felony in his state. Because Hayes had 2 prior felony convictions, he was charged under a habitual offender statute, which prescribed a life sentence for a 3rd felony conviction, and accordingly he was sentenced to life imprisonment for this crime. And the sentence was upheld on appeal. So question, was this just? Now, if you take only the incapacitation rationale, it looks like this is perfectly justified, because if you would be justified in putting him in prison for 1 month, let's say, to prevent him from committing future crimes, well, after the month has passed, you could put him in prison for another month, and that would again prevent him from committing future crimes. Now, assume, which is not very unrealistic, that however long you keep him in prison, he's still at risk of committing further crimes. I say that's realistic because in actual fact, even prisoners who get out after a long sentence frequently commit further crimes. So if you're just going by the incapacitation rationale, you can keep him in prison for the rest of his life, because for the rest of his life he's still at danger of committing further crimes, and keeping him in prison still prevents him from victimizing the out-of-prison population. But almost everyone judges that this is unjust. So the conclusion from that is that the incapacitation rationale is insufficient justification for punishment. That is, it might be part of the justification for why we imprison people, but it's not good enough if the punishment is otherwise unjust. And the conclusion from all this is that the retributive justice rationale is at least necessary for punishment. In other words, in order for punishment to be justified, it's necessary that the offender deserves the punishment that he receives. Now, in the retributive justice theory, it is pretty much universally accepted that there is a proportionality principle. That is, offenders don't deserve to get just any punishment, and they don't deserve to be punished unlimitedly. Rather, more serious crimes should get worse, that is, more harmful sentences. Less serious crimes should get less harmful sentences. Furthermore, that the punishment a criminal receives shouldn't be vastly more harmful than the crime. Now, the punishment might be a little bit more harmful than the crime. For example, if you stole $50, it might be justified to fine you $500, so it could be a little bit more harmful. And that might be necessary in order to have deterrence, right? Because if upon stealing $50, the punishment is only $50, that means, if you get caught, you're just back where you started from. You're equally well off because you just had to give back the money you stole. But if you get away with it, then you profit. So if that was the way things were, then there would be a positive incentive to steal whenever you thought that you even might get away with it. Okay. However, the punishment shouldn't be just vastly more harmful. Like you tried to steal $88 and you go to prison for life. So, and that is illustrated by the forged check example above, where I assume that we're going to judge that to be an unjust sentence. There's one more principle about just punishments, and that is some punishments are simply too barbaric to use regardless of proportionality. For example, you can't sentence a criminal to be raped, not even if the criminal himself is a rapist. Or you can't sentence a criminal to be tortured or mutilated by the state, even if the criminal himself is guilty of sufficiently serious crimes that would actually be a proportionate punishment. Now, I'm not going to give an argument for this. I just assume this because this is very widely intuitively accepted. In fact, of course, in our system, no judge ever would give such sentences. A judge would never sentence a criminal to be raped, tortured, or mutilated, regardless of what the criminal had done, even if that was a proportionate punishment. Now I'm going to go on to the arguments to try to show that America's punishment regime is seriously unjust. And the first problem is disproportionate punishments. America has drastically overly punished its criminals. So this is the core of a problem known as mass incarceration. The U.S. incarceration rate at present is around 700 people per 100,000 population. This is the highest incarceration rate in the world. In other words, we're incarcerating a higher proportion of our population than any other country, even, communist dictatorships and things like that. Now, it used to be a lot lower. It used to be around 160 per 100,000 population, but since the 1970s, it went on a drastic increase, and it has more than quadrupled. What are the problems with this? So it's widely recognized that imprisonment has a lot of problems. First of all, it's widely recognized that it does not rehabilitate criminals. Basically, nobody thinks that criminals get rehabilitated by being sent to prison. Instead, what happens is the inmates learn new criminal skills from the other inmates in prison. They get new criminal contacts because they're in an environment where they're constantly surrounded by other criminals. They also absorb antisocial values from the prison prison community because everyone in their society at that point is a criminal. They also get increased resentment against society and against the state due to the negative experiences that they have in prison. As the satirical newspaper The Onion once put it, quote, it just doesn't seem possible that an inmate could live for a decade and a half in a completely dehumanizing environment in which violent felons were constantly on the verge of attacking or even killing him and not emerge an emotionally stable, productive member of society. Another problem is that the prison system is extremely expensive, so the government spends around $30,000 per year per prisoner. Also, we have, over 2 million people in prison, which means that they are out of the workforce, and most of these are able-bodied young men who could be doing useful work. Also, prison often breaks up families. So if a man is sent to prison, if that man has children, his children are now fatherless, and so that is the cause of a lot of single-parent households. What is the cause of this mass incarceration? So libertarians are fond of blaming too many laws, and especially blaming the drug laws. The drug laws have a role in this, but it's a relatively small role. Only about 20% of prison inmates are in for a drug crime as their most serious offense, which means if we eliminated the drug laws, we would significantly reduce the prison population by about 20%, so that's significant, but that's not the majority of the problem. The majority of the problem is we've had greatly increased lengths of prison sentences. We've just gotten much harsher sentences since the 1970s. This resulted from laws that were being passed, from the 1970s on, where the legislature would just give longer sentences for crimes. They would give mandatory minimums for crimes that previously did not have a minimum, where the judge previously could just use his discretion. The legislature would take the discretion away and say you have to assign at least this length of prison sentence. We have 3 strikes laws, whereby on a third felony conviction, basically you get some incredibly draconian punishment, like typically life imprisonment. Also, we've eliminated parole in 16 states and at the federal level. So all of this has just resulted in the average length of a sentence being much longer, which means that at any given time there are a lot more people in prison. Now I'm going to talk about the arguments that we're over-punishing people, because so far all I've said is that, well, we're punishing people a lot more than we used to, but maybe we used to be under-punishing people, so maybe now we're punishing people appropriately. And there are a number of reasons for thinking this is not the case, that we are in fact drastically over-punishing people now. So one of the pieces of evidence is that American prison sentences are much longer than those in other countries. So they're typically 5 to 10 times longer than the sentences that you get for the same crimes in France or Germany, and you get similar statistics for other countries in Europe. Also, legislatures are basically overruling judges. That is, the longer prison sentences resulted from legislatures passing laws that take the discretion away from judges. Previously, judges were giving shorter sentences. Now, the judge is more likely to know what the appropriate sentence is than the legislature. The reason is that judges have the facts of the particular case in front of them. They're also more experienced. They have more experience with the prison system. They know what the criminal justice system is like, and they know what prisons are like. And they've spent a lot more time thinking about criminal justice issues. The legislature is much less likely to be able to give the just sentence. So if legislatures are overruling judges, then probably the sentences are getting less just and generally worse. Another reason to think that we're drastically over-punishing people is just that it's easy to find examples that just intuitively look like drastic over-punishment. So there was the case of Paul Hayes that I cited above, where Paul Hayes was guilty of trying to pass an $88 forged check, and he received life imprisonment for that. In 2007, there was the case of Anthony Crutcher. He was convicted for selling a total of about $40 worth of cocaine to a police informant in multiple transactions, and he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. And this was partly because of the multiple transactions, and also he had prior convictions. Then there was the case of Larry Dayries, who was convicted of stealing a tuna fish sandwich from a Whole Foods market in Austin, Texas. And partly because he had previous convictions, and partly because he allegedly threatened a security guard with a knife in order to get away with the tuna sandwich, he was sentenced to 70 years in prison. And just intuitively, it looks like these are excessive sentences. Indeed, I don't think that anyone who was just looking at these cases would think that these were the appropriate sentences. Okay, now another reason for thinking that we have drastically disproportionate sentences is that there are factors that drastically affect the sentence that somebody gets, but that seem to be irrelevant or only barely relevant to the person's desert. So we have these repeat offender laws whereby you get a drastically higher sentence for your third conviction as opposed to your first or second conviction. But it's not the case that if you commit a third criminal act that you're drastically more blameworthy than you were the first or second time you did it. A more obvious problem is what's known as the trial penalty. This is the fact that if you plead guilty, and so you take a plea agreement with a prosecutor, so you forego a trial, you get a much lighter sentence. So everything that I've been saying about the sentences is, averages. We get average, very high sentences, but if you insist on a trial, you actually get much longer sentences if you get convicted than if you take a plea agreement. So on average, people who insist on their right to a trial get 3 times longer sentences than people who take a plea agreement. And the fact that you pled guilty does not make you drastically less blameworthy. Or conversely, the fact that you insisted on a trial before being punished does not make you 3 times more blameworthy than if you pled guilty and saved the government some time and money. Now, all of that was, so to speak, about the quantitative injustice of our punishment regime, that is, that we're punishing people too much. But there's also, so to speak, a qualitative injustice, that is, we're giving people punishments that really no one should get any amount of, regardless of what their crime was. So in particular, prison inmates are frequently subjected to physical or sexual abuse by guards and by other prisoners. Now, we don't know how often this happens. There was one survey in which about 4% of inmates were subjected to serious abuse per year, but this is probably a drastic underestimate, and is partly because there's this kind of no snitching culture in the prison, so prisoners are afraid to report any kind of abuse, and they also might feel embarrassed or ashamed because of the abuse that they suffered. So there's probably a lot more than 4% of the prisoners per year who are being abused. Now, frequently the people who commit the abuse get no punishment at all. So there was a case in 2008 of an inmate named Kelly Bradley. Kelly Bradley was sitting in his cell when 5 guards came in riot gear. They jumped on him, and while they were handcuffing him, one of the guards gouged out his eye. Now, the way that we know about this is there was one officer who reported the abuse, and that officer wound up getting fired. 4 of the 6 officers who were involved in the abuse and the cover-up, which included the commanding officer who tried to cover up the incident, 4 of them have since been promoted, and the one officer who was fired was the one who reported the abuse. And so that gives you an indication of why prison abuse goes on, because the officers who are in the prison tend to protect each other, and there's typically no punishment for the abuse. Now, this leads to a prima facie case against sending people to prison. First, I assume that severe prison abuse would be morally unacceptable as an official punishment. So if a judge were to actually sentence somebody to receive some abuse of this kind, to be raped, or to be beaten, or to have his eye gouged out, or to be killed by the guards, that would be morally unacceptable. Now, if that's true, then there's also a serious prima facie problem with sentencing individuals to live in conditions in which you know that there's a high risk of that kind of abuse happening. Now, most or almost all actual prisons have a high ongoing risk of severe abuse for the inmates. And so, therefore, it looks like it's prima facie wrong to sentence individuals to be incarcerated in the actual prisons that we have. Now you might raise this objection, well, doesn't the government have a duty to prevent crime, and maybe by sending people to prison, maybe that's the only way of preventing these criminals from committing further crimes? And you might think that's a higher priority than protecting the inmates against abuse. So you might think, well, it's true that many of the inmates are going to be abused, but maybe it's worth it in order to prevent ordinary citizens from being victims of crime. And in response, I want to argue that, well, the government actually has a especially strong duty to avoid prison abuse that is stricter than their duty to avoid crimes occurring against the general population. The reason is, first of all, that the government is more responsible for the wrong of prison abuse than it is for crime in general. It's more responsible because the government is actually intentionally putting people in dangerous conditions, and much of the abuse is actually directly carried out by government agents, and that's not true of crime in general. So the government has a stricter obligation to make this stop happening. The other thing is the government is actively preventing inmates from defending themselves. So they're not allowed to have weapons, and they're not allowed to get away from a person who's threatening them. If there's somebody in the prison who's threatening them, they want to avoid that person, but they simply can't because they're locked in a cell and they're locked in this environment with the other dangerous people. Okay, and so that's not the case for crime in general. The government is not responsible for crime in general in the way that it is responsible for the abuse that happens in prisons. Now you might ask, well, why don't we just fix the prisons? Why don't we just, stop prison abuse and then continue sending people to prison? And although it would be great if we could do that, I think that's somewhat of an unrealistic thing to say, right? So the first problem is, prison abuse is a natural result of robust features of the system that are not likely to be able to be changed. So prisoners are in an inherently vulnerable position. They're vulnerable to the guards and other prisoners because they're locked up and they're just unable to get away from these people. And that's not true in most of your life. If there's somebody in your life who's threatening you, it is possible to get away from them. Sometimes, you can call the police on them and things like that. But if you're actually being threatened by guards hired by the government, you can't really do much about that. And if you're locked in a particular environment where you're physically unable to leave, there's not that much you can do about that. If you try to report the abuse, a lot of times nobody will believe you because you're a criminal. Also, if other people believe the prisoner, they're likely to just not care anyway, right? So prisoners are not very popular people because most of them are criminal. Most of them have done terrible things. And so the rest of society just doesn't give a shit that they're being abused. Also, the whole prison culture is against reporting abuse, right? Which they refer to contemptuously as snitching. So if you report that you've been subjected to abuse, then you get subjected to more abuse. And again, this is not true of society in general, but this is definitely true of the culture of prisons and criminals more generally. And so for these reasons, it's really not realistic to say that we're going to stop abuse from happening. Now, it might be possible to reduce abuse, but it cannot be completely eliminated. And so for that reason, we have to take that into account when we're thinking about sending people to prison. We have to take into account that a certain number of them are going to be subjected to unconscionable abuse. Okay, now here's the other thing that I want to say. Agents who are deciding whether to send people to prison typically do not have the option of drastically reforming the system. So by agents who are deciding to send people to prison, I mean, for example, judges, juries, or the legislature. So if you're the judge in a case and you're deciding whether to give a prison sentence to a criminal, you don't have the option of drastically changing the prison system so that there's no abuse or much less abuse. You only have the choice, send this person to the prison as it actually is, or don't send him to prison. Or if you're on the jury in a trial, you have the choice, convict this person, knowing that he's going to get a prison sentence, if that's what's prescribed for that particular crime, or don't convict him. You don't have the third option of convicting him and simultaneously radically changing the prison system, right? Or if you're a legislator, even if you're a legislator, if you're making a particular law and you're deciding what the penalty for breaking this law should be, you're deciding whether it should carry a prison sentence, If you decide that it carries a prison sentence, then people are going to go to the actual prison system as it actually is, right? You don't have the realistic option of just completely changing the prison system. Now, maybe the legislature can reform the system at some future time, but you really shouldn't just assume that that's going to happen. What you should do is wait until they do that, and then if they drastically reform the prison system, then you can start sending more people to prison, right? But until that happens, you should assume that anyone that you send to prison is going to be subjected to this risk of abuse. Okay, now how ought the system to be changed? It's possible to have other kinds of punishments besides prison. So one option is restitution. We could just have offenders be forced to pay compensation for their crimes. Now this is particularly appropriate for property crimes, which are the majority of crimes. That is, most crimes are crimes where the offender damaged somebody's property or stole the property or tried to steal the property, right? And so it's particularly appropriate for that, for the offender to just have to pay for it, and also perhaps pay some for the costs of enforcing the law against them, right? Some of the court costs that the government incurred and the costs of trying to apprehend that criminal. Okay, in the case of victimless crimes like the drug laws, that's the other common category of crimes. We could just repeal those laws entirely, and so there doesn't have to be any punishment at all. Or if you still think those laws are justified, we could have mandatory drug treatment, or we could just have monetary fines instead of sending people to jail for using drugs. There are other options that are sometimes used. So as I've mentioned, often the government gives fines for what are considered less serious crimes. We could expand the use of fines and shrink the use of prison. There's also community service, and there's also movement restrictions, like putting people under house arrest or giving them ankle monitors and then giving them restrictions on where they're allowed to go. Okay, now all of these avoid putting people in a prison, and there are a number of advantages of this. So here are the advantages of avoiding imprisonment and using these alternative approaches. So for one thing, it avoids the problem of overpunishment, especially because it avoids the risk of people being subjected to serious abuse while they're in prison. It also avoids making criminals worse. So you don't put them into this environment where they're completely surrounded all the time by other criminals, so they don't have the chance to learn new criminal skills, make new criminal contacts, absorb more antisocial values from this dysfunctional culture. It's also cheaper because the government is spending something like $30,000 a year per prisoner to incarcerate people. And the restitution option is also obviously more just to the victims of crime. In the current system, the government takes criminals and locks them up, and the victims get nothing. In the restitution system, the criminals are forced to work to pay back the victims. So the victims will get at least some compensation for their crimes, which they almost never do in the current system. What about objections to this? So first, you might worry from a retributive justice standpoint that criminals will not be getting the punishment that they deserve. But in response to this, I've argued before that what we're currently giving criminals is not just retribution. We're drastically over-punishing them. And remember that the retributive justice rationale is governed by the proportionality constraint, right? So if you believe in retributive justice, it's not that you think that we should maximize the punishment, it's that you think we should give a proportionate punishment. And if we're over-punishing people, that violates the norm of retributive justice just as much as if we're under-punishing people. And so I've given evidence that we're drastically over-punishing people. So if we change the punishment regime so that instead we focus on restitution, we'll probably stop over-punishing people. Another objection, you might worry that if we reduce the use of prison, we will reduce the deterrence to crime. Now, it's important to note, as I noted before, that deterrence alone is not enough to justify punishment. So it might be true that we'd be reducing the deterrence by some amount, by reducing the overpunishment that people are currently receiving. But it's still not okay to drastically overpunish people, even if that does deter crime, right? So for example, suppose that the penalty for jaywalking was execution. Then I bet a lot fewer people would jaywalk. But that's still wrong, right? We should not do that, even though that would deter the crime a lot more. Okay, there's also evidence in social science research that the probability of being apprehended for a crime is a lot more important than the severity of punishment. Right, so the severity of the punishment might make some difference, but it's mostly the probability of actually being apprehended. So if we can increase the chances that criminals actually get some sort of punishment, then that's going to have a much greater deterrent effect than giving this drastic overpunishment where you send them to jail for 20 years and things like that. Okay, now why do I not call for just completely abolishing prisons? There are some people who call for abolishing the prison system entirely. Now, I think that that is a completely unrealistic proposal. And that's because there are two kinds of offenders who I think clearly require prison. The first is serious violent criminals. So you take the example of, say, Ted Bundy, the notorious serial murderer. In the 1970s, Ted Bundy, he was a psychopath. He murdered something over 30 women. It might have been a lot more than that. We don't really know how many people he murdered. They caught him in 1977. He then escaped from prison, and while he was on escape, he murdered 3 more people until they caught him in 1978, and then they held him in prison until they executed him in 1989. Okay, so now that is a person who requires prison or execution. You cannot let that kind of person out because, if you let him out at all, he's just going to murder more people and cause more harm than, the harm that he himself would receive by being in prison for the rest of his life. So you have to imprison him for the rest of his life or execute him. Okay, the other category of offenders who require a prison sentence is offenders who refuse to comply with other sanctions. Right, so let's say that the initial penalty for a crime is a fine. The government orders you to pay a $1,000 fine or whatever it is, and let's say you refuse to pay. Okay, well then the government has to escalate the sentence, right? At some point, so they could start by saying, oh, well now you have to pay a late fee. You didn't pay by the specified date. Now it's $1,100 or whatever. Okay, but if you just keep refusing, to do the other thing that you're supposed to do, right? They order you to do community service, that you refuse to go to that, and so on. Well, eventually they're just going to have to arrest you and then put you in jail or something like that. Fortunately, though, this would almost never happen. So empirically, it's been found that when people are threatened with prison, they do comply with the other sanctions, right? If people are threatened with going to prison unless they pay the fine, they pay the fine. Okay, now you might object, well, why wouldn't it be unjust to imprison even the violent criminals for the same reasons that I said it was unjust to imprison criminals typically? You might think, well, there's this threat of prison abuse, so the violent criminals could be subjected to abuse that nobody should be subjected to, so why doesn't it show that nobody should go to prison? And in response to this, I want to say, well, we don't have an absolutist notion of ethics. Some amount of risk of prison abuse has to be accepted in order to have some amount of benefit. Now, if you take an absolutist view of justice, where you say no risk of injustice is ever acceptable no matter what the benefit, then you basically have to completely shut down the criminal justice system. In fact, you can't give any kind of punishment to anyone, because if anyone is being punished, there's always a risk that you'll punish an innocent person, which is unjust. If justice is an absolute value, then you can't take any risk, so that means you cannot have any punishment whatsoever. Now, I assume that that's an unreasonable position, right? And in fact, virtually nobody holds that position. Right, so if we accept that some risk is acceptable for some amount of benefit, then we have to kind of look at the ratio of costs and benefits. Now, violent criminals are actually less likely to be abused while in prison than the nonviolent criminals. So, and the reason for that is, well, the weaker people are more likely to be picked on by the more violent people in the prison. Okay, it's also less bad for serious violent criminals to be abused than it is for the less serious criminals to be abused. Okay, it's bad for anyone to be abused, but if you're just in for smoking an illegal drug or something, and then you get beaten and raped, that's worse than if you're like a murderer and you get beaten and raped. Also, the harm of releasing, or the risk from releasing serious violent criminals is much greater. So if you have this drug criminal, or you have a thief and you let them go and then they commit the crime again, it's not so bad, right? If the thief then steals some more money, okay, so that's bad, but that's not irreparable harm. But serious violent criminals are very likely to create irreparable harm if they're released. And so the conclusion is it's totally plausible to say that it's worth it to imprison serious violent criminals, but it just is not worth it to imprison people who are only property criminals or drug criminals or guilty of some other relatively minor crime. So in conclusion, America's current punishment regime is seriously unjust, and we should be reserving prison sentences only for the serious violent offenders.